Did Aristotle invent the idea behind universal basic income 2,500 years ago? Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Aristotle's Politics. Today, we are finalizing Book 7. Final chapters of Book 7 are all about the importance of leisure, virtue, and character in public life. Even land distribution becomes philosophical tools for shaping citizens who can judge, deliberate, and flourish. He even hints at something that sounds suspiciously like universal basic income, a society where basic needs are covered so citizens can focus on higher goods. Then, as if that wasn't enough, we jump into explaining how to build walls to stop a catapult or why cold plunges matter for physical health. So stick with me till the end while I uncover all of these while also offering my own comments and analysis. If you enjoy these topics, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Please consider leaving a review as this helps the show reach more people. And for daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. And now on with Aristotle's Politics. Right away from the start, Aristotle is talking the structure of political life. There is this basic problem. Who should do what and to what extent in a given society? Do we want everyone participating in everything, or do we want specific roles only available for certain people with certain characteristics? Aristotle is asking a deeper question beneath these examples. He's trying to figure out the best system, the one where human beings actually get to live the happiest lives they could have lived. This best system would be the happiest compared to all other options that it could have been. And since happiness cannot, in his view, exist without virtue, he immediately draws a line between the kinds of lives people live and the kind of city that emerges. In this city, citizens need leisure, because leisure is not a luxury for Aristotle. It is basically the raw material that is needed for the cultivation of virtue. No leisure means no reflection. No reflection means no wisdom. And here's the part where Aristotle says it is evident from these things that in the city that is most finely governed, one possessing men who are just unqualifiedly and not relative to presupposition, the citizen should not live a worker's or a merchant's way of life. For this sort of life is ignoble and contrary to virtue. Nor indeed should those who are going to be citizens in such a regime to be farmers, for there is a need for leisure, both with a view to the creation of virtue and with a view to political activities. So this is a direct quote from the book 7. So in summary, Aristotle says that the life of perpetual necessity, of constant labor, is incompatible with the task of judging what is just and virtuous for a community. Then Aristotle talks about public life having two elements. There is the armed element, military component, and the deliberative element. The part that fights and the part that judges and decides. The military power and the prudential power. And the big question is whether these two elements are fundamentally different. Should they be assigned to different people, or should the same people carry both responsibilities? We encounter a big problem here. These two things, power and ability to judge correctly, belong to different parts of life. But at the same time, those who have authority over arms also have a say on whether the city will last or not. So Aristotle's move here is clever. He argues that the same individuals should hold both forms of authority, but at different points in their lives. Aristotle says that in general, power/energy will be found in younger people, and wisdom or prudence will be found in older people. So as a general characteristic. So it is one of those moments where you can almost hear him like shrug, as if this division is just obvious. Young people fight, other older people think. Rotate the responsibilities as you rotate through life. I think what he means is that as a person in different points in your life, you will go through different stages. When you are young, you might need to be general, but once you are older, then you step back from this life and become a wise counselor to king, let's say, or something. He sees the political community as an intergenerational arc. No one is stuck with one identity forever. The same person with the same citizenship simply actualizes different parts of themselves at different ages. Now, I'm not sure if it aligns with the modern world, this idea, but it makes perfect sense for ancient times. Because let's say when you are a regular 17-year-old in ancient world, you probably go to army to prove yourself or go to some distant lands for adventure and spend time there maybe 10, 20 years instead of going to university like today, let's say. So a world where a 17-year-old is not worrying about college applications, but worrying about spears. So in our world, if you told a teenager they would spend 10 years proving themselves, they would assume you meant internships. So Aristotle's main thesis here is that distribute these two powers to the same person, but at different times. The young people provide energy, the old provide judgment based on their experience. Another point that is emphasized here is that the city will be deemed happy if all parts of it are happy, not just a single segment or single minority. The city's flourishing is collective. Collective flourishing requires virtue, and virtue requires leisure, and leisure requires not being trapped in the cycle of endless labor. If we can give a very brief summary of this chapter, my understanding here is that Aristotle almost worships the concept of citizenship and keeps insisting that citizens should have free time to deliberate about virtues, study sciences, and philosophy, and the life of dedicating your whole life to being a farmer or artisan or merchant is not compatible with this idea. This obviously cannot be applied to any modern society. Aristotle's system simply belongs to a completely different historical context, if you think about it, as modern economies rely heavily on the concept of specialization. But it still gives an idea that even if you are so busy all the time with your life, with your work, still you should be able to dedicate some free time to finer things in life. Take your mind out of whatever occupies your day to reflect on virtues, overall humanity. That would be the modern interpretation of this idea. That seems to be the only way to avoid becoming a purely functional creature, someone who works but never examines the shape of their life. The life of dedicating your entire existence to being a farmer or artisan or merchant simply isn't compatible with this understanding, according to Aristotle. It is not because those lives are dishonorable, it is because they trap you in necessity, and necessity crushes the space required for reflection. And here's the part where I would criticize Aristotle's framework. If he is comfortable assigning different functions to the same person at different stages of life, as we explored before, why can't we extend that logic to the economic side? Why can't someone spend, let's say, 20 years working through their life, dedicating themselves to a craft, whether it is farming or running a business or building something of their own, and then enter public life afterward? If we accept the distinction he made earlier between the armed element and the judging element, and we accept that you don't need to be both at the same time, then what exactly prevents us from applying the same flexibility to economic roles? Why can't someone live a life shaped by work, responsibility, even exhaustion in their early years, and then after building some stability, step into the leisure and reflection that public judgment supposedly requires? So I think Aristotle's answer to this criticism would probably be that the habits formed in a life of necessity cling to you. If you spend 20 years working in the field or building a business, you supposedly carry that orientation into public life with you. You become too practical, maybe, too focused on survival, too embedded in the world of exchange. He seems to assume that labor fixes your character permanently. But again, you can make an argument that you run to this difficulty if you allow someone to become a soldier for 10, 20 years before entering public life. So it's the same thing. The idea that leisure is the only path to virtue misses the fact that responsibility, pressure, failure, discipline, and collaboration are also moral educators. And some of these things come when you dedicate yourself to a craft, for example. So that would be my criticism of this idea. In chapter 7, Aristotle suddenly shifts gears and becomes a historian. Out of nowhere, he starts giving these accounts of how different societies in Egypt, Italy, and Crete divided their populations and structured their social classes. And the theme running through all of them is the same problem. So, how do you understand the mass of people? And how do you carve that mass into meaningful categories? What classes should exist? Where does citizenship begin? And who belongs outside of it? And Aristotle makes this funny remark about the name of Italy. Italy is named Italy because of a once famous king named Italus, Aristotle says. So before that, the land was actually called Oenotria, and the people called themselves Oenotrians. But then, to honor this king, they just renamed the entire country Italy and started calling themselves Italians. That's it. One guy gets a name upgrade, and suddenly an entire civilization has to rebrand. Aristotle notes that the separation of the judging element, by which he really means the citizen element, from masses, first arose in Egypt. Then he pivots to the topic of land distribution, and this part reveals one of his more pragmatic instincts. He reminds us that private property should exist and not everything should be public, because once something becomes fully public, it risks becoming neglected. This is also what sociologists today call the what's it often called tragedy of the commons. The logic here is that if you use some public land or some public utility, you always will have expectations that someone else will take care of it and someone else will maintain it. And if everyone, you can imagine, if everyone has that mindset, then over the long term, this public utility deteriorates and eventually no one can use it actually. So, in case you were expecting Aristotle to turn out to be a communist, then I'm sorry. Aristotle's proposal to this problem is simple. Uh, Land should be private, but its use can be public in the fashion of friendship when needed. And if you read the other book of Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, you already know that friendship is a big deal in Aristotelian understanding of ethics. So, a hybrid model. You own the land, but you are not necessarily using it in an isolated, defensive way. Private ownership with communal openness when appropriate. He also says that no citizen should be in the want of sustenance. So, this is where things get a little bit more interesting and spicy, in my opinion. So it says no citizen should be in want of sustenance. Let me emphasize that again. He says that no one should be in the need of sustenance. He says that everyone should be fed. Their basic needs should be covered. Such a crazy idea. You might think that recent exploration of the idea of universal basic income is a very new phenomenon, but it seems like it was kind of casually endorsed already by this guy, by Aristotle, almost 2,500 years ago. So, anyway, he says that citizens should have enough free time, they should also be fed, and they should have enough leisure to deal with important matters in life. And if they are not fed, they will always preoccupy themselves with survival needs and thus will not be able to be real citizens and do citizenry activities. He ends this section with a compromise structure for the land distribution. The city should have two kinds of land, common and private, and then each of these two types should be divided further. Common property to be divided into one, land for public service relating to the gods, and the second, land supporting the expenses of the common masses. Private property again to be divided into two, just like common property. The one, land toward the frontiers, meaning the borders of the city, and two, land toward the city, land away from the borders of the city. And he links this distribution to motivation and character. If someone owns land near the borders, they live closer to potential enemies or raiders. That changes their mindset. They develop different incentives, maybe a more energetic disposition, maybe a closer link to military life, let's say. Meanwhile, those with land closer to the city have different concerns, different responsibilities, different forms of stability, different risk appetite. So at the end, both groups will not envy one another. Those who land, those who have land near the borders, nor those who have land inside the city. So this whole chapter was about Aristotle trying to solve the details of citizenship. Who counts, how they live, how land supports their lives, and how the city structure must be built so that the citizens actually have the conditions required to be citizens. Aristotle opens chapter 11 by basically summarizing the geographical essentials. He says that the city should have access to the mainland, access to the city, and enough territory to sustain itself. All of that is clear. But there is this one principle. The one principle to remember is that the city should be positioned in such a way that it should be easy for citizens to evacuate in the times of emergencies, but difficult for adversaries to approach and besiege. The main idea here is that you should be quickly able to move the citizens out of harm's way, while your position should make it so much more difficult and slow for adversaries to advance. Your physical position should slow the enemy down, frustrate them, force them to fight uphill, metaphorically or literally. For example, if your city sits on top of a mountain, this makes perfect sense, yep, because you can see the enemy coming from miles or kilometers away. You can evacuate down the other side. So geography becomes an asset in that sense. He also says that cleanliness is important. Cleanliness meaning having access to clean water. Figuring this out in case a city is besieged from outside invaders. Because if enemies surround the city, you can't go out and fetch water. You need wells, reservoirs, hidden supplies. So the type of cleanliness that is meant here is not a aesthetic preference, but more of a survival infrastructure. Aristotle then says that it is very important that cities have walls to protect themselves. This should be understood in the context of the ancient world. This is how cities usually protected themselves. Thicker and longer walls usually delayed the process by which invading force can enter the city. In the world where there are no aircraft or missile launchers, but just horses and swordsmen, then walls played huge importance. If an invading army could not capture the city, they would usually set up a camp nearby and then start besieging the city, in some cases for years, to destroy the walls or cut off the supplies and find a way for inhabitants to just open the gates and give up. And in a world with no aircraft, no tanks, no guided missiles, where your invading force is basically men on horses with swords, then walls were the difference between collapse in a week or survival for years. So it is in this context we should understand when Aristotle says cities must have walls. Then he adds a funny comment about recent inventions. New missile technologies like catapults, the ancient world's version of cutting edge warfare. And he says that the city must employ experts who know how to deal with these devices. So I can't help wondering, for example, what he would think if he suddenly respawned in the 21st century and witnessed aircraft, helicopters, tanks, drones, long range ballistic missile systems. The man thought the catapults were high tech. Imagine dropping him into a modern military environment. He would probably assume the gods were angry. He says that not having walls in a city is similar to not having doors in your own private house. It signals to the world that you've left your safety to chance. And walls don't just protect you once the enemy arrives. He notes something very strategic here. He says that some armies will not even attempt to attack a city with strong, well built walls. The cost is simply too high. The risk is too great. A well fortified city is a deterrent before the battle even begins. We see this pattern actually everywhere if you read about the ancient and medieval history of warfare. A conqueror can sweep through an entire country in a matter of weeks, defeat its armies, burn its fields, take its towns. But there is always that one castle or one mountain city that refuses to fall. One tiny, stubborn place that takes years to break. You have seen this, for example, in the Mongol invasions. Sometimes they would capture the whole country in a matter of weeks, but they would spend years just to capture one castle. So this is the hardship of the ancient world for invaders. And Aristotle is smart enough to realize the importance of perfecting this defense system for a city, exploiting this natural advantage. One final comment he makes is that it is enough to talk about these details because it is easier to speak about them and theorize about them endlessly, but it's so much difficult to make it happen in practice. Chapter 13 is honestly a gold mine because, again, we are going back to basics in chapter 13. We were so much into details in the previous chapter, but chapter 13 is about going back to the basics of human nature, basics of ethics, importance of human life, and so on. So this chapter deals with the questions such as what is the ultimate purpose of life? Who counts as a good person? How can someone become a good person? And why is this relevant for the purpose of public life? Aristotle lays out two things in life that contribute to the aim of living well. First, you need a correct articulation of the end goal. You have to formulate what the end actually is before you talk about any means, any instruments. Second, you have to discover the activities, the endeavors, tools for achieving that end. So it is end first, means second life philosophy. Aristotle says that sometimes the end is perfectly clear in someone's mind, but the means are missing. And sometimes the means are perfectly available, but the end is unclear or non existent. It gives us this grid of full spectrum of human confusion. So, for example, sometimes you have a clear end. Let's say you want to become a university professor, let's say. So great, crystal clear, but you have no means. Maybe you live in a war-torn country. Maybe you are a soldier in First World War, so you can prepare your dissertation in the trenches, for example. End is clear, but means are not available. Other times, it is the opposite. You have the means. You live in a peaceful country, you have opportunities, you are surrounded by resources, but your end is not there. Maybe you are lazy. Maybe you don't want to dedicate your life to anything important. You drift because nothing in you has committed to a direction. And sometimes both are available, mean and end. Aristotle says that in all arts and sciences, these two conditions are important. People strive for living well. Everyone wants a happy life, but it is not always open to everyone. You can cultivate your character, you can work on your virtues, you can focus on what you can control, but he still acknowledges that external goods such as safety, healthy body, having good parents, and having some financial means matter. And this is where he breaks sharply from the Stoics. If we oversimplify with these two philosophies with the risk of missing some details, we can argue that the Stoics treat virtue as sufficient for happiness. So virtue is all you need. Aristotle says no, virtue is essential, yes, but without some external goods, a happy life is blocked. So, in a very rough sense, you can say Stoic ethics is more noble, while Aristotelian ethics is more pragmatic. Good news is that virtue is always within your control. Aristotle even has this famous quote where he says, "The man who is truly good and wise will bear with dignity whatever fortune sends, and will always make the best of his circumstances," which still shows that virtue reigns supreme compared to external goods in his philosophy. Then he brings us back to the city. If we say we want to live in the happiest city, then we need to define what happiness is in the first place. And here Aristotle reminds his students, probably in a lecture, because these were the collection of notes by his students, these books. He says that we already defined happiness in the Ethics. This is a reference to Aristotle's other major great work on ethics, which is called Nicomachean Ethics. So happiness is the actualization and complete practice of virtue, or in other words, human flourishment, eudaimonia, as it's called in ancient Greek. flourishment of the individuals. So it is not simply the pursuit of hedonic pleasures, but more close to the idea of self-actualization. That is very similar to also Maslow's idea of hierarchy of human needs. When we say happiness, we are really talking about happiness in an unqualified sense, meaning that it's not based on any presupposition. If something is a means to some other ends, that is not happiness. So let's say, does having a lot of money equal happiness? Aristotle would say no, because we never pursue money for the sake of money. Well, we may say that we pursue it for the sake of money, but in reality, we don't do it. Maybe we are lying to ourselves, but we don't do it. We pursue it so that we can live comfortably. Money is means, happiness is the final end. If you choose something for the sake of itself, then that's the ultimate aim. So he says that's why happiness, defined here as human flourishing, as the complete practice of virtue, becomes the final human good. We pursue it because of what it is, not because of what it gives us. He adds another layer here. For the excellent and noble person, things that are good are unqualifiedly good. Their goodness does not depend on circumstance. For example, courage isn't good because it helps you in a specific situation. It is good because it's good, and that's enough. If you find yourself saying something is good only because of some presupposition, then it's not really good. But if something remains good regardless of context, then that's your ultimate good. Now, with regards to external goods, things like having good parents, having good health, these aren't entirely up to us. Some of them come from chance or fortune or nature. But virtue is different. Yep. This is something that we also talk about in the previous part of this series. Virtue is always within our control. So while external goods are necessary for a full, happy life, they're not the ultimate things. The ultimate things are the ones that come from your character. Then Aristotle says, let's apply these principles to the city and see what happens. Because remember that we started by saying that we can't understand the happy city before we even define what is happiness. So now, luckily, we have our definition. City's excellence, Aristotle says, should come from knowledge and intentional choice, not from luck, not from the work of fortune, not from the whim of the gods. If a city is happy, it should be because its people build it that way. A city is happy if its citizens are happy, Aristotle says, and citizens will be happy if they live in accordance with virtue. This will make them excellent. It will make them good. Then comes the big question. How does an individual become good and excellent? Aristotle gives a three-part formula. First, nature. Second, habits. And finally, third element, reason. Nature includes taking care of your body and taking care of your soul. But that's not enough, because habits can either destroy you or cultivate you. If you eat junk food every day, you destroy your body. If you eat well and exercise regularly, you cultivate it. Other consideration: if all you do is consume junk content, endless reels until your brain feels like it's dissolving, then you're also damaging your soul. But if you dedicate your real hours to deep reading, deep work, genuine human connection, then you cultivate your soul. So that's why Aristotle says that habits are the slow sculptors of who you become. And lastly, the final component, the reason. He says that reason is the only thing that separates humans from animals. For example, how do you know whether a certain habit is good or bad for your nature? Through reason. Humans can be persuaded to change their habits. Humans can override their own nature if the evidence is strong enough. We can hack our own system using reason. And all of these components, nature, habit, reason, are leading toward a larger point. Aristotle is preparing the later argument that the ultimate work of a legislator or a wise ruler or a wise king is to create the conditions in which human beings can use all three. The task here is to build a social structure where people can develop into excellent individuals. In chapter 14, Aristotle says that if there were human beings who differed from others as sharply as gods differ from mortals, then the question of hierarchy or who should have authority over the other would be obvious. The superior, wiser, more benign being should always rule. Well, I would say that things get a little complicated if we apply that logic to the modern era. Because, for example, with all the hype about the emergence of super intelligent AI in the future, you can't help wondering, would Aristotle say it is morally right, for a super intelligent AI to rule over everyone? If it really were superior in intellect and moral reasoning, would he treat it as the godlike category? Well, he would probably ask, this is my personal guess, is that whether such a being actually has our good in mind, which also points to the alignment problem of AI. Aristotle says we are not divided into mortals and demigods. So he says it makes sense for rule to be shared in turn among human beings. Everyone in some fashion is to share in ruling and being ruled at different points in life. For people who are similar in virtue and education, Aristotle says equality is justice. That's his line. If citizens are properly educated, if they understand their nature, cultivate good habits, and activate their reason, then they are capable of rotating through positions. So, how should this rotation be organized? Aristotle says one obvious method is by age. Older people ruling, younger people obeying. And then eventually the young become the rulers in the future. And he thinks the youth won't object to this because they know their time will come. They're not excluded permanently. They're simply waiting their turn. And there's a deeper logic here to Aristotle's credit. Aristotle thinks that one should rule only after having experienced being ruled by people more experienced and more virtuous. You should feel what it's like to be on the receiving end before you take charge to get the complete picture. But Aristotle also warns us not to get carried away or imagine that ruling is just about domination or mastery over others. So this point is something that Aristotle keeps returning back every chapter, every book, that remember, we are not talking about mastery over individuals. Politics is a noble aim, noble goal. And he repeats this here again. He says that's not what is meant by politics, what's meant by ruling over society. Rule is for the sake of the ruled. Ideally, the ruler has the best interest of the ruled in mind. They are more experienced, more virtuous, and therefore better positioned to direct others toward flourishing. So this kind of rule isn't for the sake of accumulating power. This aligns with the idea that leadership is a service. Role of the legislator, according to Aristotle, is to understand how the ruled can become good and virtuous. So the role of legislator should be to cultivate virtues and habits and reason in the ruled. And here we kind of start regretting that this type of education never became a part of mass schooling systems today. Schools rarely teach kids how to manage emotions, how to form friendships, how to communicate well, how to reason through complex problems. The capacity to expand one's reason, to train the soul, does not even seem to be priority in a modern education. Aristotle will look at our education system today and would probably say you're producing functional adults, not flourishing ones. Aristotle repeats again that peace and leisure are the necessary conditions for cultivating individuals. He again criticizes Sparta and those philosophers that admire the Spartan regime. So Sparta was good at one thing: domination and warfare. Spartans did not know how to be at leisure. And there's this famous quote also in this chapter where he says, most cities of this sort, meaning Sparta, preserve themselves when at war. But once having acquired imperial rule, they come to ruin. They lose their edge, like iron, when they remain at peace. The reason is that the legislator has not educated them to be capable of being at leisure. I would also recommend more modern application of this idea in the famous book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, if you are interested in exploring this idea further. Then Aristotle wanders into the part of the book where he starts making recommendations about marriage, at what age people should marry, and how these things should be regulated. And this is where you really see the influence of Plato on him. It is that impulse to design society all the way down to the everyday details. To his credit, even though Aristotle is quite pragmatic in understanding human nature and desires, he can't help but go into the territory of designing regulations and rules for everyday life. For example, he says that the difference between a man's age and his son's age is quite important. If they are too close, that makes a son lose respect for his father. He also says that man and woman should not be too young when they procreate, because when they are young, they are still inexperienced. They may not care for their children that much. He also says that couples should always listen to doctors and what scientists say rather than superstitions for their romantic life, family disputes, or practical matters regarding raising children. Both men and women, he says, should take care of their bodies and they should exercise regularly, not for the sake of looking muscular and for the sake of exercise, but for the sake of having a clear mind and healthy bodies. Interestingly enough, Aristotle then starts talking about cold plunges, especially for small children. He says that cold exposure raises endurance, and he even mentions that some barbarian tribes just throw their newborn babies into cold rivers, and that's why they are so resilient over time with regards to health. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these episodes, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or follow and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can find this show on all major platforms, and for daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. If you missed the earlier episodes, go check out earlier episodes also, because the concepts and theories that I have covered here builds upon the discussions that we have had in the previous chapters. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. I've had one recently with Roman Yampolsky on AI and simulation, with Massimo Pigliucci on Stoicism, Stephen Hicks on enlightenment, Spencer Greenberg on rationality, and Anil Seth on consciousness. And more are on the way in the next few weeks and months. Check them out if you're interested. Until next time, bye.